Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Kristy Williams, and you are here to take a look at the teenage brain. We're going to look at its physiological, emotional, and spiritual aspects. But before we get started, in a spirit of honesty and transparency, I stand before you feeling a little bit strange, honestly, because number one, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not from Europe. And number two, I'm definitely not a neurologist. If you are looking for a European scientist who's studying neurology, I strongly recommend talking to Dr. Alexander Fink. I went to his movie last night about the brain. It's amazing. He's doing great things in this very topic, but he's the real scientist. I'm just a practitioner who loves youth. But there's a good reason why I am here, and so let me explain that to you. This is my husband and I, and when we grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, outside of Chicago, and when we were 16 years old, in the 90s, a missionary from the Czech Republic came to our church and said, come to Czech, come do peer evangelism and tell our young people about Jesus. And we said, okay. So we went for 3 weeks, we taught English, and it was then in 1997 that my heart just started beating for Europe. And I remember turning to my friend before he became my husband, and I said, hey, if they ever asked us to be missionaries here, you think you'd do it? He said, yeah, I think I would. And I said, I know, me too. And so if you fast forward years after that, in 2007, we said yes to the call, and we joined Josiah Venture to become full-time missionaries as youth leader, trainers, and equippers of people working with youth in the local church. But if you're looking closely at the photo, you might notice that the clothing we're wearing is definitely not Czech national clothing, and that word epocha at the top is definitely not Czech letters. God had a little bit of a different plan, and so we started a team in Lviv, Ukraine. So I come to you with 12 years of experience in Western Ukraine. I still love Europe. I love training youth leaders, and my ministry/job takes me to train leaders in 14 different countries, and I love every bit of it. And another part of my ministry is working in the Department of Education as a volunteer in our city of 1 million. We have 104 schools with teenagers in them, just in our city. And so I talk to those workers about child development and helping young people. And I'm so thankful for the opportunity. And one time they said, hey, what lectures could you offer us? And I said, well, I'm doing this like personal investigation stuff on the teenage brain. Are you interested? And they said, oh, yes. And so I have a privilege to read lectures to high school students, to their teachers, to their parents, and to youth workers about what's going on in the minds of our young people. And so this is my favorite lecture. I promise you, you will get a lot out of it from one practitioner to another. So let's begin at the beginning where all good stories start, which is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And eventually he creates Adam and he creates Eve, and they have a brain. And in scripture, we talk a lot about the soul and a lot about the spirit, but I was looking for a good passage that connects us to the physiological part of us. And of course, we find Psalm 139. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame, my body, my brain was not hidden from you when I was made in that secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days written for me and for you were written in his book before one of them came to be. And I went to a Christian school, and in 6th grade, they said, memorize this passage, it'll change your life. And I still remember it to this day, and it does. Because God has a plan, always had a plan for our brains. And unfortunately, with the fall, a lot of times when we think about the actual brain, We think about brain damage. We think about chemical imbalances. We think about learning disabilities. But the truth is that even in our fallen world, the brain is amazing and God has a great plan. And oftentimes we know that we don't know, science doesn't know all that much about the brain, but it continues to learn and to study and to develop this field of science. And I just want to pass along to you that which has been influencing me. I love this lecture because it's awareness. Really all it is about making us aware of what's already happening. And so that's okay if you don't know much. Now we have the left and the right hemispheres, that's right. And so the left side is logic, science, structure, math, things that are very concrete. On the other side, we have abstract, we have music, art, emotions. And maybe my first piece of advice, just while we're on this picture, is that let's stop labeling our children and our young people that they're either left-brained or right-brained. Because what we're doing is we're telling them, hey, you're really great at this, and you're really bad at this, but because their brains aren't fully formed yet, we're actually limiting them, because they have the capabilities to be left and right-brained from the very beginning, and in time, what they do with their brain will form who they become. Their personalities and their skills are not yet developed. So be careful with the labels. Let them be both a science guy and a language guy. Let them both be emotional as well as logical, and watch as they develop long into their 20s. And don't worry, we're going to talk a lot about that, but I just wanted to throw that up there while we were talking about the two sides of the brain. I have another question for you. Maybe this one will be easier to answer. What do adults think about teenagers? And now I'm looking for stereotypes here, and I would love it. This is what I say to my high schoolers, because I teach high school a lot. Give me 10 things, okay? 10 stereotypes that adults have about teenagers. Emotional. Hungry. Hungry or angry? Hungry, okay. And angry. Okay. Loud. Yeah, total rebels. Good. 5 more. Always on the smartphone, irresponsible, confused. No, not always the smartest, but they think they're the smartest, right? They think they know everything. Longing for relationships and influential. Thank you for giving a positive thing. Because when I do this exercise, what ends up happening is this very thing. Always the negative stereotypes come out, and once in a while, a positive one will pop up. And then my second question to them, to the young people, is always, do adults like you guys? And it's almost universal across every classroom I've ever been in. They're like, no. So they said they don't. I don't think they really care that much about us. Adults don't like teenagers. And I say, oh, what a pity. So, well, don't worry, I'm working on that. I'm going to teach the adults on how to like you guys again. But so we live in this world of stereotypes about young people. However, as you know, often in a stereotype, there is at least a fraction of truth. Some fractions are bigger than others. And so the things that you said actually are partially true. Maybe some of them are actually fully true about young people. So we're going to look at these stereotypes, the very ones that you named, and we're going to figure out why do they do that. So let's look at one more picture of stereotypes. This is a little bit differently depicted. The stereotype, the biggest stereotype is that they're very emotional, that they think about sex all the time in the back. You notice how the sex is in the back of the mind, like it's always running in the back. The emotions are ruling on the top. The sleep center is in the middle. I think that's very cute. There's some sarcasm happening around the mouth. But look at the little green part in the front lobe of the brain. Can anybody read that out loud for me? Common sense. And so there's this stereotype that what belongs here are certain functions, but those functions are real small, and that their common sense is really underdeveloped. And that is 100% true. So let's begin and take a look at the brain. And I want to make sure I tell you some things about hormones and some things about brain development. Okay, so this photo is really just 5 brains being looked at from 2 different angles. So this is the 5-year-old brain that's very colorful, all the way down to the 20-year-old brain, which is pretty dark blue-purple, but not entirely. And so there's 2 things. Don't worry. Like I said, I'm not a neurologist, so we're not going to go deep into like all of this stuff from this kind of scientific angle or perspective. But you've got to know this, because this changes everything. The brain develops from the back to the front. And so as you watch, the brain starts to get more and more blue. And the goal in this picture is to get an all blue, all purple brain. That means that the connections have been made, the tissue has been formed, and it's fully developed. However, let's rewind more than 15, 20 years ago, during the time before we had MRI or MRT, I don't know how you guys call it in your countries, but before we had the technology to take good pictures of the brain. Before that, there was this assumption, and it's been throughout all of history, that once the body was physically developed, that meant that you were an adult. So you go through puberty between the ages of 10 to 13, ending around 18, and once you finished puberty, once your body was sexually developed, that meant you were an adult. You were ready to vote, to go to war, to get married, to have a family. And that was the standard for a really long time. You're 18, you're an adult. And then this technology comes out that lets us take pictures of the brain and actually see the connections being made and how developed it was. And can you imagine? It was the shock of the century for brain scientists. And they said, wait a second. We expected that second to last brain to be fully purple, no questions asked. And when you look at that second to last brain, that's a 17-year-old, you say, wow, it's not entirely blue and purple at all. It still has about 20% of development to go at the 20 age mark. And so what that told us is they took pictures. They saw that the brain was finally fully developed at the age of 25. My friends, that's like post-college age. That's post-college graduation, but we're treating our young people like they are adults around the age of about 16. And so we as adults are not on purpose, accidentally abandoning our young people long before the time is that they should be fully released from our care and love and protection and support. Young people are growing up so fast, and they're growing up too fast because their brain is actually behind and it's not ready to take on all of that responsibility. So let's talk about hormones and let's talk about the prefrontal cortex, okay? So as the brain develops from the back to the front, that means that the last function is here. It's called the prefrontal cortex, or the executive center of the brain. And now you're not going to be shocked when I name for you the 7 things that happen here. These are the last things to be fully formed in the adult brain as it's approaching adulthood. Number 1, planning. Number 2, organizing. Number 3, emotional self-control and regulation. Number 4, responsibility. I know I'm going fast, so I'll go back through those. 1, planning. 2, organizing. 3, emotional self-control and stabilized emotions. Number 4, responsibility. Number 5, wise decision-making. Okay, rational decision-making. Number 6, personality development. And number 7, self-awareness. All 7 of those functions happen in the prefrontal cortex when that part of the brain starts making the connections and making the tissue stronger. You want me to say the last few? Number 4 was responsibility. Number 5, wise decision making. Number 6, personality development. And number 7, self-awareness. The ability to step outside of ego and egotistical self-centeredness and be able to see others outside of yourself. This does not mean, my friends, that teenagers can't do any of those things or someone in their 20s can't. They can. It's just that the functions are underdeveloped. They're not fully developed. They're not fully mature in those areas yet. And so when we start to think about young people, we put these expectations on them because they want to be treated like adults, so we start treating them like adults. But they're not ready, and they still need a lot of help. So I will be giving you some tips about how specifically you can help them in those executive function development areas. But I also want to talk about hormones before we go further. Okay. So when we're born, God created it this way, that we're born with the hormones progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen, okay? Those hormones are in every body from birth till death, okay? You're born with those hormones. But what happens is the physiological process of puberty right now in our society between the ages of 10 and 13, when that moment happens, pretend like you're in your bathroom, okay? And in your bathroom, you have a faucet, a sink, and a faucet. And that metal faucet is dripping water, like drip, drip, drip. And that's what the body's doing. It has these hormone centers, and it's dripping hormones into your brain. And that's fine. But when age 10 to 13 hits, it's replacing that faucet that's going drip, drip, drip with a fire hose that's on automatic spray as though it's fighting a major forest fire. That faucet opens full blast, and it doesn't close again until around the age of 17 or 18. And that's how the brain is functioning. And my friends, there's nothing we can do to turn off that faucet or that fire hose. I was reading some statistics to try and refresh my memory on some of this stuff, and I was reading something out of Harvard, and it said that the teenage male in his body has 30 times the amount of testosterone as any one of you gentlemen in this room. That's not 2 times. That's not 3 times. That's 30 times the amount of hormones that a regular adult is producing. And so what that tells us is that, okay, and you must know that those hormones being released go to 2 places in the brain. They go to the emotions and they go to the aggressive center. And so what happens is you have emotional highs and lows, and you have aggression highs and lows that are affected by this hormone spray that's happening. And so when you tell me that teenagers are angry, or guys are aggressive, or girls are emotionally unstable, it's true. It's 100% true. And there's nothing really we can do about it except teach them coping mechanisms on how to manage their emotions. Now, praise God, we have the Holy Spirit. And so when we're dealing with Christian young people, we can say, listen, the Holy Spirit gives us self-control. The Holy Spirit teaches us how to not be angry and things like that. But think about it. The world doesn't have the Holy Spirit. And so there's just the explosions of anger, different emotions. And young people don't really have the coping mechanisms to know that. And most of the world doesn't realize that this emotional, or that this hormone explosion, it's very normal. That it is what it is. And the great news is that at 18, when the faucet turns, when we go from the fire hose back to the bathroom faucet, it goes back to a drip, okay? It slows down. The production slows way down, and they start to be able to regulate again. And so that's why parents joke and say, oh, Lord, just get me through 18. Like, that's all I need. Help me to get through the age of 18. And there's a reason why people say that, because it does scientifically stable out, okay? Let's keep going, and let's talk about the brain as a Lamborghini. The teenage brain truly is like a Lamborghini. A Lamborghini is incredibly powerful, but also has the potential to drive out of control very, very easily. And so mechanics and engineers said, oh wow, these cars are so prone to going out of control, we need to put a stabilizer on them, traction control, that will help the driver not spin out of control all the time. And this is very similar. It's a great analogy to teenagers and their emotions. So we're going to watch this very short clip. The driver in the first half, the first part of the video, is driving without traction control. And with one little turn of the wheel, all he wants to do is go a little bit this way. He turns the wheel and watch what the car does. It is not his intention. And then in the second half, he turns on that electrical function of traction control, and watch him take that steering wheel and move it all around and watch what the car does, okay? So let's watch. He's trying to go straight. He had no intention of going backwards. Our young people don't want to be emotionally out of control. Now watch. And he's like, oh my goodness, watch this car practically drive itself. He's going to try and get it to spin. He's going to try and get it to do those crazy things he was doing just a moment ago. And he can't. No matter how hard he tries, he's actually staying in the lines and going quite straight. And I think about our young people, that their intention, I work with them all the time, they don't want to have these emotional outbursts. They don't want to be out of control. They're not doing it on purpose. Truly, it gets the best of them, just like the Lamborghini in the beginning. And so we need tons of grace for our young people. I'm not excusing their behavior, but I'm saying that it's more serious, I think, than we think. Their bodies are out of control. They don't know what's happening. And who's going to tell them, if not us? Now we're going to talk about my favorite part, which is the learning. I told you, the brain has tons of potential. And the brain is at peak development in the same stage. They can learn faster, learn more, memorize, and accomplish far more than an adult in full development brain stage. So these pictures here are synapses, and it's electrical connections that are happening all the time. So any input, you guys are listening to me, and so your brain is making these connections. For young people, the same. Anything they see, anything they hear, anything they experience, the brain's just doing this. That's the purpose of the brain. Connect, 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 connect. And it's constantly connecting. Whatever they're watching and observing, it's making these connections. The most interesting thing the scientists found out is that the brain doesn't have a growth path. We actually tell our brains why to connect. We feed our brains the map or the path to follow. The brain doesn't know the difference between good and bad learning. So this picture is meant to talk about good learning. So what's good learning? Positive learning. That's when you tell young people, don't skip class. Even if you emotionally don't like history, sit and listen, take your notes, do your homework. Learn as much as you can, because this is the time when the brain's strengthening and it's making these connections. The tissues are getting stronger. If they choose not to take their studies seriously, they're doing their brain a disservice because the brain stops connecting. They're not giving it any input, or worse, the input of video games and social media. If that's the only inputs that their brain is taking, what they're telling their brain is, Instagram is awesome, Instagram is awesome, Instagram is awesome. And the brain doesn't know the difference. So the brain connects, and it's making these paths about Instagram, which isn't going to be very helpful for them down the road. We want our young people to be free to explore, create, develop as much as possible in this key window. Because after that period of fully developed brain stage, they can learn. You're all learning from me right now. It's not that we can't learn, it's just not as easy. The connections are ripest right now. So when you see a young person who's showing signs of interest in something, our job is to help them pursue those interests. Let's give them more opportunities to experiment, to try out new things. And that's why I told you with that first picture, don't put labels on them. Don't tell them, oh, you're not a language guy. Because what you just did is you told him to tell his brain, don't ever make those connections in language because you can't, or you're not good at it. Which is totally not true from a science perspective. Yes, there are strengths and weaknesses, but the personality doesn't fully develop, and those skills don't fully develop until much later in life. So that's why we still promote science and math for everyone, not just for one specific gender. And that's why we promote music and foreign languages from a very young age. Because those are things that are just doing amazing things, they say, inside of the brain. Those connections are just getting so strong, and that's what we want for young people. So the potential to learn is really good. And so if you have, for example, like some teenagers who are maybe breaking the law, truant, not going to school, that's a real problem because the brain builds on itself. So every connection you make in your chemistry class, let's just say, it builds on itself and it keeps getting stronger. But if they're not making many connections there, then there's nothing else to build on. It's actually quite logical. And so their foundation is weak and they're missing. They'll have certain learning gaps in their brain because they never taught their brain that that was important, okay? But the brain is learning like a wild bush. So it's just, like I said, we tell our brain what to learn. So I'm interested in this, and my brain's growing, shooting out new branches, new connections, new. But the brain, because it doesn't have a plan, its only plan is to prune, which if you don't know this word in English, it's when you take the scissors to the bush and you make it look nice. You cut off the extra branches that don't belong. And so the brain somehow knows this concept we say in English, use it or lose it. So if you're not using certain functions for a long time, the brain says, well, the human's telling me that's not important, therefore I'm not going to pay attention to it. And with time, it sort of just cuts it off. So either we're making connections that are going deeper, or we're telling the brain that's not important, don't pay attention to that. And the brain won't. The brain won't pay attention to things that you don't tell it to, which is really interesting. And so the brain kind of creates this way to filter because we're getting in so much information. But then there's the problem of bad learning. Like I said, the brain can't differentiate between good and bad learning. If you like to watch skiing, or if you ever watched the slalom, you know, they go down the hill, and those grooves, if you don't know this word rut, the word rut there's a positive meaning and a negative meaning. A positive rut, I read last night that the word rut is from the Old English word route, path. So either a rut is a path, just like train tracks or tram tracks in your city. We have a nice tram, and those are the ruts, the tram ruts, a path. Or a rut, we say to get stuck in a rut. And that means that you're deep into something, your wheels are stuck, and you can't get out. You need extra help to get out of a rut. You're stuck, okay? So the brain is like this skier, and so you're going down the hill. And every time you do something, you're making grooves in the snow, grooves in the snow, grooves in the snow. And that's a good thing, because every time you do the same thing, this is called habit forming. Every time you form a habit, the grooves, hypothetically, in the snow get deeper and deeper. And so that's why we can do things automatically and not even think about them. It's because grooves in the snow have happened so many times. Those ruts, the positive ones, are so deep that we don't even have to think about it. We just do it. It's kind of like, for example, when I lived in America, I studied Spanish, because that's what you do near Chicago. And I studied Spanish for 10 years. I lived in Mexico. I worked there. And those learning ruts in my brain, those are good learning ruts. They're real deep. So then I moved to Ukraine. I started learning Ukrainian and Russian. And now I don't use my Spanish path anymore. But when I go back to Chicago and I start hanging out in a Latino neighborhood, luckily, those habits were so deeply formed that it would only take me probably a couple weeks to get back into the swing of Spanish. Although the reality is I haven't spoken Spanish in 12 years. But those ruts, those deep ruts, are good. And that's why we ride bicycles, and that's why we can play the guitar without sometimes thinking about it. But there's also bad learning. Let's take the example of a simple example, saying bad words. So in English, we can call them curse words, swear words, bad words. You know, a kid is 8 years old and he decides he's going to rebel and say a bad word. And everyone's like, oh, no, you should never say that. A year later, he says it again. He gets some attention, he says it again. And as the young people get older, they just have all of these bad words coming out of their mouth. And the brain doesn't know that that's bad learning. It's just learning to the brain. So those ruts. They say a curse word and another one and another one. And suddenly they have really bad language, really bad speech. And those ruts are so deep that when it comes time at their first job interview, when they're 22 years old and they're trying to make a lovely impression to the boss, and they say some dirty word on accident because those ruts are so deep, it just came out, and the boss says, I'm sorry, sir, we would love to have you as a candidate, but professionalism is important to us, and you are no longer an option for us, I'm sorry. And the young person thinks, oh man. And he couldn't even help it because those ruts were so deep, and the brain doesn't know the difference sometimes, okay? That's why habit forming is so important. So if you're working with young people, my recommendation for you is if you see a habit in your son, daughter, neighbor that you would like them to form, start practicing it with them. As you saw in my photo, I'm a mom to Marissa and Dylan. They are 7 and 8. There are a lot of things I want that are good habits for them. However, their brain doesn't know that those should be good habits. I'll give you a quick example. I want to teach them that when they walk into a room of adults, that they should look you in the eye and say, hello. I just think that's polite. Wouldn't it be lovely if we had polite children who could look you in the eye and say hi? So their brains don't know that that's important. So I start telling them, okay, when we walk into a room, we're going to look you in the eye. We're going to say hello. And we practice it. And guess what? Those learning ruts are just deep enough now that I don't have to remind them. And they walk into the room and they do it. We are responsible to help our young people with good habits. And those good habits aren't just being polite. It's also very practical things that the prefrontal cortex is weak at. For example, planning and keeping a calendar. Young people have a very hard time filling out their day planner. Now, there's some responsible ones, but most of them are not. And so it is very appropriate for you to sit down with your 16-year-old and say, okay, let's sit down, let's make a plan for the week together. Let's write it out together. Now, they might think that that's babyish because they feel like they're an adult already. Oh, come on, Mom. You don't have to help me with that. I can do it. You say, okay, show me your day planner from the last 3 weeks. And you open it up and it's empty. Maybe one little thing written on there. You say, no, this is a habit that's important for you to have. You can't start that habit on your own. You can, but it's probably not going to go so well. Let's do it together. We can still model these things for our young people. Another one is the state of the cleanliness of their rooms or wherever the place is where they study. Where do your young people study? At the kitchen table in a mess of groceries and receipts and trash and chaos in your kitchen? In your dining room where it's nice and quiet? Or in their bedroom where they're listening to music, on social media, watching YouTube videos, and doing physics homework all at the same time? And they also have some novel open and they claim like they're reading it. And the person who I took a lot of my material from, she is a neurologist, and she has 2 boys, and she said they were preparing to enter Harvard University. These were incredibly intelligent young men. And she said she was shocked by how smart they were academically and intellectually, but in the basics of life, they still needed mom. And so mom went into their room. They're going to Harvard next year, and she still sits down with them, helps them with their calendar, helps them clear out the chaos. She says, give me your phones, guys. Give me your phones. I need to help you because you can't be so disciplined on your own sometimes. She takes their phones, takes them out, and she sits down with them, and she gives them time, love, attention, and maybe sometimes they don't like it, but guess what? They're making habits. They're making good habits that will go with them for the rest of their lives. So I ask you, what kind of habits are you growing up in your young people? Now we have to go to the sad part of bad learning, which is addiction. Super sad. So the brain doesn't know that these substances are bad. Now you see narcotics, alcohol, and tobacco. And you also see that I added a few: pornography, sugar, and online gaming for the meantime. I'll explain the add-ons in a moment, but let's focus on the big ones, because those are the big ones. So the brain has something called the dopamine center, and the dopamine is a reward center. So what happens is when you put any of these 3 substances, which are actual chemicals, you pour those into the mouth or into the vein or into the lungs. Those chemical substances go straight into the dopamine receptor of the brain, and that gives reward. And the brain says, wow, I really like that. But now let's say they read their favorite novel. Let's say they were Harry Potter fans. They sit down, they read Harry Potter. Their brain also lights up and says, wow, I like that. But of course, with the substances, when it goes in, that dopamine receptor explodes. And it says, wow, I like that. Give me more. The brain doesn't realize it's damaging for it. It just wants more, and it wants it now. And so a learning rut happens, and then they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. And remember what I told you about those synapses, those electrical connections. The brain's making all of these connections. And so when you do drugs, you make a connection. The problem is that those connections are irreversible and they're damaging. And alcohol, drugs, tobacco, it goes straight to that prefrontal cortex and it damages the ability to connect. And so those connections get damaged. There's actual real huge consequences. It's not just a joke or a stereotype that they're ruining or frying their brain, we say in English. Don't fry your brain. It really is frying. It's electrically shorting out their brain, and they can't recover from certain things, from certain brain damage. And so they use again and again, and they go into those ruts, but it's the bad rut. It's when, for example, my little kids are riding their bikes on the tram tracks, and there's that space in the track, and their little bicycle wheels get stuck in the track. If you've ever had that happen to you, you actually can't pedal out of it. You have to stop, get off of the bike, pick up the bike, and take it out of the ruts. I say that because there's good news. There is rehabilitation. There is hope. It's not hopeless. We can help them get out of the ruts. The problem is that those ruts are really deep and they're formed, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of investment to get out. So what if we just did it so that they didn't get into those ruts at the first place? So how can we do that? I'll tell you how we can do that in a minute. Let me talk about these 3 other things. So scientists knew that these things are chemicals, and so when we put chemicals near the dopamine center, it makes a certain reaction. However, no one thought that pornography could be so damaging because pornography is technically just a photo. It's not a chemical. Sugar's a chemical, right? So I could see how sugar could cause that, right? Online gaming, well, that's just playing video games. It's just what you're looking at. But now when scientists put those brain helmets on and study the connections and take pictures of the brain while they're looking at pornography or while they're doing online gaming, they're saying that the exact same thing is happening. That dopamine receptor, it's just like it's lighting up like crazy. And they didn't think that was possible at first because it's just a picture. It's just a video game. It's just something on a screen. But it's incredibly damaging, and the body wants rewards. That's its job. Young people want reward, and so when they see it, they just have to have more. I believe that one of the best things we can do in the early years to prevent them from ever getting here is to fight the lie. It's a favorite teenage lie, which is, that will never happen to me. We all said it. I remember saying it. I didn't say exactly these things, but some things you might hear from them are, I won't get pregnant, not me. I won't get addicted. I won't get arrested. I won't get caught. That's for stupid kids. I'm not that. That'll never happen to me. And the truth is that it will, and it very, very possibly could happen to them. So again, like I said before, our job is to raise awareness. So prevention programs in schools, sometimes teenagers roll their eyes and say, oh no, not another movie about why we shouldn't use drugs. Yes, another movie about why you shouldn't use drugs. They need to see the consequences of what's happening, and they need to know that it could happen to them, and it is happening to young people in their city, at their university, etc. So let's raise awareness. We don't have to shelter our teenagers from the risks and the bad consequences of using these things. Quite the opposite. We want them to face the reality of how dangerous this really is. Risk-taking is kind of another form of that. This is another video that I like to show, real short. This is actually a Ukrainian man who goes by the nickname Mustang Wanted. He has a YouTube channel that's very famous, lots of likes, lots of hits, lots of views. And he is famous for going up to, I don't know if it's the Burj Khalifa or not, but up to a large, tall building in Dubai and doing really interesting things. Let's take a look. He's on a crane. He has no ropes. He has no clips. He just has his hands and his video camera. He is incredibly high up. And this is one of many of these videos of his. He's kind of famous in his circle for doing these interesting things. Oh, he made it to the top of the crane. And now he's going no hands with his selfie stick to take a video of him on top of the world. It's always pretty interesting to watch. And now I always like to ask my audience, does he know that this is dangerous? And does he know that he could die? He absolutely knows it. But the reward of doing risky behavior outweighs the risk. And this is how young people operate. They don't operate like you and I, where you and I would sit down with a pad of paper if we needed to, and we would make a list of pluses and minuses, pros and cons. Pros, lots of likes on my YouTube channel. Pros, become famous. All of these pros of why this could be cool. But then we'd also go to the cons or the minuses. We say you could die, you could really get hurt, it's a bad example. We would weigh the pros and the cons, And we would say, this just isn't worth it, no matter how exciting it is. But young people don't rationally make this list of pros and cons and then measure the two. They just want to know what's going to give the most reward, the most satisfaction. They're impulsive, as you've probably experienced, because they don't understand this balancing out of pluses and minuses. So again, as their caretakers, as lovers of the next generation, we can actually sit down with them when it comes to making decisions in their lives, whether it's risky decisions or regular decisions, especially like decisions about what kind of car do I buy? Should I go to university? Where? They get really stressed out because they can't make those decisions on their own. Remember, the decision-making area isn't fully developed, and they start to spin out of control like the Lamborghini. They need us to sit down with them and say, let me help you make a list of pluses and minuses. Let's talk through this. They desperately need us to talk through it with them. Our job is not to decide for them, but our job is to help them make wise decisions by talking through a lot of things. This picture is cute, and it's totally true. That at this developmental stage, relationships are everything. They don't really trust adults because they feel like they've been abandoned by adults. I'll explain about that in a minute. And so they cling to each other. They have clusters, they have little cliques and groups, and that becomes like their second family. And relationships are so important to them, and that's one of the huge reasons why young people feel a lot of stress, because think about it, hormones are spraying, emotions are going up and down, which means one day you're friends, one day you're not, one day you're kind, one day you're mean. And the relationship world that they live in is in fluctuation. It's chaos. And then they have hormones, sexual hormones also in the fire hose. So they're thinking about boys and girls, their identity. And it's really important to them, their friend groups. I think something we can do for them is to teach what is a real friend. I'm always amazed by I'll say to my Christian girls, right, because I disciple young women, like, yeah, I'm getting kind of, my friends really want me to like go to a party and like start drinking with them. I'm like, wait, who wants you to do that? My friends. I'm like, do you think that's like what a good friend does? Because that doesn't sound like a good friend at all to me. My friends respect me and my decisions, and they would never pressure me into doing something at all. And I think that they're like, oh gosh, I never really thought about that. We can talk to them about what it means to make good friendships. There's a proverb, and I'm not going to quote it well, but I want to use it, which is like, he who walks with the wise grows wise, but a companion of fools like falls apart or gets destroyed or something negative. He who walks with the wise grows wise. And so our job is really to help them make wise decisions about friends. Start weighing, is that really a good choice to hang out with them? How are you doing influencing them? I also want to share about systemic abandonment. Systemic abandonment means that they're in a system of being abandoned accidentally. Young people today, let's say they're 15, that means their parents are in their late 30s, early 40s, late 40s. Our generation is obsessed with success and getting ahead in our careers. We're bombarded by inputs all over the place. And what that means is that mom and dad are always busy pursuing their own ambitions. It's just a fact. Mom and dad have tons of career space and opportunity, and they're pursuing their dreams. And the dreams are at their fingertips because we have more in this generation than ever before, access to everything. And so young people look and see that mom and dad are definitely busy with their own lives. And so they start to withdraw. And when they sit down at the kitchen table and mom is on her smartphone, dad's on his, and the kids are on theirs, and they're like, hey, mom, and mom's not listening because mom's thinking about her own life, they start to realize that I think adults have checked out on us. Adults aren't interested in us anymore. And so we absolutely have to be able to set aside our own dreams and ambitions and things we want to accomplish, and remember that we still have a huge obligation and responsibility and privilege to invest in them. Nothing's new under the sun. They need our time. They need our love. They need our acceptance. We have the rest of our lives to pursue those things. Let's not lose them in the process. I want to talk about stress. There are 5 things that are working against young people in the area of stress. It is not a cliche. Young people are under more stress today than you were when you were a teenager. It is not helpful when you say, "Oh, I understand, I was a young person." You actually don't understand fully because they're growing up in an all-digital age and you did not. You don't understand what it's like to be connected 24/7 from birth. And you have a fully formed brain that can say, okay, enough with the phone, I'm going to put it away. I'm going to do some things that fill me up outside of social media land. They weren't born with that. They were born into a really different society. That's the 21st century that I'm talking about, point number 2. Point number 1, THP. Honestly, I don't know much about it, but it's called the stress hormone. So it's another hormone that's dripping out of the body. But for whatever, and the purpose of THP is to calm us down in stressful situations. But scientists are concerned because they say as soon as puberty hits, THP does the opposite. During puberty, it actually makes young people feel more anxious. It doesn't calm them down, it kind of stirs them up. And then at 18, it goes back to being a calming agent again. So they have their own body fighting against them. Social media, they are stressed and anxious because they have access to every single person in the world's life 24/7. They feel insecure. They already feel bad about themselves. They're already struggling with their identity. And then you put social media and pictures of everyone and everything right up in their faces all the time. So what it's causing them is to compare themselves all the time. And if they can't detach from that device, it makes it really hard for them to understand reality. Detaching from the device is key because after an hour, some studies showed that after an hour on social media, the satisfaction of being on social media starts to go way downhill. And that's good for us to know too as adults. Great, be on it up to an hour, but just so you know, after an hour, it starts to become negative. You stop getting those positive feelings that you get when you want to go and check out what's going on in the world today, okay? So limit to an hour at a time. Number 4, I've told you this already several times. Planning, organizing, responsibility, self-control, self-awareness, all of those things are not personality. They're not fully developed yet in the front of the brain. And so what that means is that they have to make a decision, but they don't have the function in their brain to make good decisions. They have to deal with a stressful friendship situation, but their emotions are all over the place. They don't have all of the functions that we have that helps us stabilize in our lives much easier. They did some study about a stressful situation for an adult, and it took that adult 30 minutes to calm down. It took the same young person about 3 weeks to calm down. They are that sensitive and vulnerable to stress. They carry it very heavily. And then that systemic abandonment that we talked about, which means that they don't have adults to go to because adults are busy with their own lives. And so they're trying to navigate adult life and the entry into adult life alone. And that's a terrible place to be when you don't have the functions to be able to do that. So I beg you, our job is to walk with them in this. And they might resist. They might fight you. They don't necessarily think it's cool to hang out with adults on the outside. But on the inside, a study was done out of Fuller Youth Institute in Pasadena, California. Dr. Clark did a study, and he spent a semester in high school, and he just chatted with teens, trying to figure out what do they really think about adults. And so they shared all this information. The book is in the bookstore. It's called Hurt 2.0 by Dr. Chap Clark. It's an excellent book about the hurting generation. And they said, we wish we had adult friends. We wish we had adults in our lives, but it's just hard to trust, and we don't know exactly how to get them. So somewhere in their heart, they do realize that they need you. And so our job is to be stable when they're not. Our job is to walk with them and say, I know you don't want to hang out with your mom right now, but I love you and I care about you, and I'm going to do this with you. I'm here for you. They so need our support, even when they're fighting us. And so that leads us to the Christian perspective. My lecture's almost over here. When you see the crowds of young people, may your response be like Jesus. Because when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. And I've taken this verse to heart. So when I walk the high school halls, I just pray and I say, God, they need a shepherd. They need adults to come in and care about them. Lord, use us however you can. And it gives hope. It gives hope, and it helps us. Does this lecture not soften our hearts to who they are and what they're going through? And it just gives floods of grace and compassion in their truly weakest moments. I used to think that was just like a joke, that the junior high, like 7th, 8th, 9th grade is so hard. It's the worst time of their life, a lot of people say. I think that's really true now. I really think it is the worst part of their life if they don't have the coping mechanisms to get through this, especially if they don't have Jesus to get through it. The last thing I want to share with you before I give you just the last list of tips is identity. So when they were studying the path in psychology to adulthood, it's interesting too. I don't know if you've heard this new theory of emerging adulthood and extended adolescence. Because they're saying if the brain isn't fully formed until age 25, that means that there's this middle ground. They're not teenagers anymore because they're older than 19, but they're not adults either yet. And so if you're interested in this topic, look up emerging adulthood. What is his last name? Arnett, Arnett. And he's doing some interesting things, looking specifically at that university age, if that's your age of choice. I like the younger ones more, so I haven't done a lot of look into that. But they do say this, that in order to travel from youth into adulthood, you must be able to answer the questions of identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my purpose? And I love these 3 questions because we can ask them to non-Christians and get great answers and talk to them about the Lord. And so our job is to help shepherd them in this way. Our job is to help them fight the lies that are fighting against their identity. Ephesians 1, I always say as a youth leader, it's the best chapter in the Bible to do a study about our real identity in Christ. And all of the things that we get when we become a child of God. They need us to keep pouring truth and reminders of truth in their lives because they get lies from the media, from school, from public society all the time. And we need to help them answer these 3 questions, and we can point them to Jesus by doing that. And here is my top 11. The good news is we don't even have to really read these because we have hit all of these points in the lecture. But if you would like a quick summary of what you could do to make a real difference after hearing this, this is what you want to know. I'm going to just call off the stuff that we haven't addressed yet. Number 3, it's cutting off on the side, but if you can count down, don't panic when they rebel. This period of aggression and heightened emotions, it's real. It will pass. As parents, our job is to be stable when they can't be and to teach them how to manage their emotions. So don't panic. And remember, their job is to test your limits. They want to see if they can really trust you. They want to see if your promise to accept them at all times is actually true. And so we need to have lots of grace. Today in my track, I don't know if I told you, but I teach at the youth ministry track here. That's how I got here in the first place. And we were studying the story of Jesus and Peter when they met in John, I think 21, after Peter had denied Christ. And they finally get this one-on-one time. I don't know exactly if it was one-on-one, but you're imagining this intimate conversation between Jesus and Peter, and he's saying, do you love me? And it's this, hey, you've messed up. Peter, you blew it. But I'm here, and I'm offering you breakfast of fish. I'm offering you 153 fish from the boat, and I'm offering you renewed relationship after you messed up. Isn't that we look to Jesus, and we can do that for our young people. They're going to really need that, and we're not going to panic. Jesus didn't panic when Peter made a mistake. Jesus didn't panic when Judas made a mistake. Jesus was stable and said, it's going to be okay. They're not adults yet. Don't set the bar too high. This one's important, number 8. Up here, I'm sorry. Yeah, we want to be pointing them to prayer, God's word, for sure, and having one-on-one talks with a mentor. But up here, when the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, they're having a hard time organizing themselves. That means that when you tell them, go have a devotion, make sure you spend time with Jesus today, don't forget to read your Bible and pray, they may do it, but they may not, because they may not have the habit of doing it. We got to do those good learning ruts and help them have spiritual discipline habits. You need to model it for them, do it with them, and eventually in time, they will know how to do a devotion by themselves. They'll know how to go to Jesus by themselves, on their own, in discipline. But I think sometimes we think they're just going to learn those disciplines overnight, and they're not. They really need us to show them how to do them. So keep that in mind. And, number 9, they're already under tons of pressure. Don't add more pressure to them. Don't use your desire that you always wanted to play the piano, but you didn't. And so therefore you're making your kids play the piano. Like, it's okay, they can play the piano. But don't put extra pressure on them. They have the rest of their lives in front of them to grow and develop and figure out things. Don't add to their already stressful time of life. And boundaries. We think they're adults, so we stop disciplining them. And it's important. They need to be disciplined. They need to have boundaries. They need to have curfew, which means what time they should come in. They need to have family time. And they need to learn how to put their phones away. That's totally okay for you to make those rules. They still live under your roof. You can have rules. They might not like it at first, but over time I believe they'll appreciate it as they reconnect with you as a family. Okay? And point them to the Lord. That's the best thing we can do. Teach them to go to Him. They don't always have to come to us or to their friends, but they can go straight to Jesus, straight to the counselor, the Prince of Peace, all the time. And lastly, these are the books that I believe in. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know everything that these authors believe, so I'm not promoting them as people or their worldview, but I did really appreciate what they have to say. So just if you take those on, read them with a filter, just like you would do with any other literature.